Hello, my name is Rabbi Yehuda, or as many know me as Rabbi Leonard Blank, Director of Programming, Chaplaincy Commission, and External Affairs for the Rabbinical Alliance of America, and moderator for this presentation. Technology and Halacha, the use of mind-controlled robotic prosthetic limbs, Shabbos, Yom Tov, and other areas of Halacha. Tuesday, October 5th, 2021, 5782, Tשרי, Tavshin, Pei-Beis. Please note that all participants are muted, and should there be time available for questions, can only be submitted via the Q&A or chat located on the bottom of your screen. Questions should be submitted in English. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Rabbinical Alliance of America and Rabbinical Council of America websites. I want to thank Rabbi Moshe Shmerler for his professional expertise. It is an honor to have professional healthcare chaplains from two of the largest and renowned Orthodox Jewish rabbinical organizations in the United States of America, in Israel, and other countries as well, both with distinguished Roshei Yeshiva and Rabbanim as their members. It is also an honor to have joining with us distinguished men and women, professional healthcare chaplains from throughout the United States of America and beyond, belonging to the Orthodox Jewish Healthcare Chaplaincy Listserv, whose goals are to distribute and share vital professional chaplaincy information and camaraderie between and amongst the healthcare chaplains. The leadership of the RCA under Rabbi Mark Dratch, the leadership of the Rabbinical Alliance of America under Rabbi Mendy Marachnik, and the leadership of the Orthodox Jewish Healthcare Chaplains Listserv and the RCA Healthcare Chaplaincy Committee under Rabbi Daniel Kramer continues to inspire the essence of Torah, Avoda, and Gemilas Chasodim. This program being presented is another opportunity of enhancing and conveying the importance of Torah and Halacha in diverse areas, such as you will learn from our distinguished presenter. We are also honored to have joining with us all other Rabbanim and all other chaplains from throughout the United States of America and beyond. Our presenter is the Rosh Kollel of the Kollel Jewish Learning Center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He has delivered many shiurim on medical halacha concepts to physicians in the Pittsburgh community and offered presentations at the local hospitals, medical centers, and to the broader medical community. He is a co-author of the American Thoracic Society policy statement on managing conscientious objections in intensive care medicine. And now it is my honor to introduce our distinguished presenter, Rabbi Levi Langer. Rabbi Langer.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rabbi Blank. To begin with, I want to assure everyone that even though, unfortunately, I have a cold and a cough, I do not have COVID. I took a PCR test and it came back negative. And in addition, I live far away from you, so you should be safe. To begin our topic today, we need to take a moment to discuss a big cutting-edge topic called brain-computer interface, or BCI. A brain-computer interface is defined as a communication pathway between the brain and an external device. And in the case at hand, in our subject today, we're talking about the following. Whenever the brain sends out messages to any limb and the rest of the body sends out a message to the arm to move, to lift something, It does so by means of neural pathways. And the neural pathways hold electrical impulses that are sent out by the brain. And these electrical impulses are transmitted to the limb in question. And in the code that's encoded within these impulses, the limb is told whether to move this direction, that direction, or to perform whatever activity. Scientists today are able to utilize a device which can pick up these electrical impulses, and they're even able to decode them, so they can determine whether that impulse that was sent out by the brain, what limb was intended for, and what action it was intended to do. And they can utilize these electrical impulses, they can pick them up with an external device. And this device, this computer, is able to transmit a command to a machine, and the machine is able to perform an activity which the brain wills it to perform merely by means of the thoughts of the brain, which are converted into these electrical impulses, and which in turn the scientists are able to convert into commands to perform a machine. So for example, we have something that was actually done a few years ago was that scientists were actually able to take these electrical impulses, which were created by the thoughts of the brain, and actually able to remotely transmit them wirelessly to a car that was parked nearby, and that through the brain impulses and through the thoughts, the car actually started and moved X number of feet. The car wasn't even connected to the person at all, but the person's thoughts were wirelessly picked up by this device, and that in turn powered the car and caused it to move. So you can see how this is cutting edge technology. Scientists have been hard at work at it for several years, and it has the ability to really, once they're able to harness it and use it accurately and precisely, can really transform our universe in quite a number of ways. Particularly, scientists are able and are working on using this device to power prosthetic devices so that the thoughts of the person will create these impulses, which were picked up by the prosthetic device and which will command the machinery in the prosthetic arm, and the prosthetic limb, the leg, foot, whatever it is, to actually perform an activity. And over the course of the last several years, they've been working hard on it. Right here in Pittsburgh, there's actually a facility in one of the universities where they've been performing experiments. And which gradually they're able to be more precise and able to be more effective at able to get these prosthetic limbs, these so-called robotic arms, to actually perform activities that are merely powered by the thoughts of the brain, which are being converted into electrical impulses. Just a couple of examples. In November 2016, which is 4.5 years ago, scientists were able to create that they had paralyzed monkeys which were able to walk again using a brain implant. So what they did was that they actually severed the spinal cords of these monkeys in a laboratory, and then they attached the device to the brain stem to pick up on the messages that were being sent out by the electrical impulses being sent out by the brain. And they had another device, a receptor, that was attached to the legs of these monkeys. And this device picked up on and recreated the electrical impulses, and the nerves of the legs of the monkeys moved, and the monkeys were able to walk by means of these impulses, despite the fact that the spinal cord had been severed. This is a very, very important development, and as scientists are expecting that in the future they'll be able to do something similar with human beings as well. And here we're not talking about a prosthetic device, but we're talking about someone whose nerves have perhaps been severed, the spinal cord was severed, and therefore the information for the brain is not able to be transmitted to the rest of the body, and the rest of the body doesn't, the limbs don't work, the person is paralyzed. Using this technology, it's expected that they'll be able to actually be able to reconnect the nerves in the various limbs of the body to the brain and to the impulses that are being sent out by the brain. So that's a very exciting future which is foreseen. It doesn't involve prosthetic limbs in that case. It involves actual usage of the person's own limbs, which have been paralyzed and which apparently will be able in the future to be able to be commanded to perform activities. Recently, earlier this year in May, of 2021, there was right here in Pittsburgh, they actually they came up with a new advance, and they used a brain-computer interface that evoked tactile sensation. So that's actually a two-way interface, so that the robotic arm of the individual was able to so to speak, feel the surface. It was a rough surface, it was a smooth surface, it was a surface of a cup, actually feel it, and it was a computer, it's a robotic arm, but it sent out messages to the brain, which was transformed into electrical impulses that the brain was able to pick up on and receive. And the brain of the individual in the lab was a paralyzed person in the lab. The brain of the individual in the lab converted that into a sense of tactile sensation, into a sense of feel. Then the person sent out messages based on that from his brain that he wanted his robotic arm to perform a particular activity. The scientists were very gratified to see, very excited to see that by means of recreating this tactile sensation, the person was able to much more accurately be able to perform those activities, because a sense of feel, a sense of touch is really quite important in being able to perform activities, perform these functions. So all of these are kind of advances, little by little, which the scientists are working on. And this is definitely something which is expected to have quite an exciting future. Now, in the field of halacha, not a great deal of work has been done on this subject to determine the use of these robotic arms. For example, on Shabbos, this is a very important topic. The question of whether these robotic arms will be able to be utilized on Shabbos. They do actually obviously involve utilizing machinery, and the person is commanding the machinery to be used. The robotic arm is, after all, a machine. When it comes down to it, and using electricity, which we don't use on Shabbos, and you're using these commands, these impulses for the brain, which is utilizing the machinery in this robotic arm and commanding it to do act. Is there some way to do this on Shabbos? Will it, yes or no? Will it be permitted on Shabbos or not? Likewise, there's questions in other areas of halacha, questions about kedushin and gittin. Under the chuppah, the chassan puts the ring on the finger of the kala, and she's mekudeshes, she's married. He doesn't have to put it on her finger specifically, la halacha, but he does have to do an activity which puts it from his possession into hers. It has to be an action. If it's not an action on his part, it's not an effective kedushin. Well, in this case, the person has a robotic arm. What if he puts the ring on his finger, her finger, using his robotic arm? Will that be effective halachically? Will it be a kedushin? With regard to gittin, with regard to giving a get, we're always very careful and very precise about exactly how it's communicated from his end into hers. If you've been in a get, you've seen how very careful we are. It needs an activity. Even nosan biyoda, the pasuk says that clearly. The Gemara has all kinds of sugyas in Masechta Gittin telling us about the activity that has to be performed on his part. What if the person uses his robotic arm to put the get into her hand? Would that be effective? What if a person does damages by means of his robotic arm? Is he responsible for those damages, and so on and so forth? So these are all important areas of halacha. Not a lot of work has been done on it. If you want a little proof that not a lot has been done, you can Google brain-computer interface halacha, and you will see, which I did just recently. I was quite incredulous to see that the very first Google search result that comes up is actually me. You click on the result and you can see I'm the first search result. I can tell you later how that came about, but I was quite astonished that a small-time introverted person like me ended up being the first place in the Google search results. But clearly more prominent rabbanim and a lot more work needs to be done on this topic. But let's take one subject first, and we'll take it from there. Approximately a dozen years ago, there was a symposium that took place in Bar Ilan University in Yerushalayim. It was headed by Rabbi Dr. Shabtai Rappaport, who, as you're probably familiar, is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's grandson-in-law and the editor of some later volumes, one of the editors of the Igros Moshe. And he headed this symposium, and it was a real cutting-edge symposium on the subject of brain-computer interface in halacha. At that time, a dozen years ago, the field was really quite just very beginnings. It was just getting off the ground. And Rabbi Rappaport headed the symposium. I discovered it, and I sent him an email asking him if he could send me a DVD of the symposium. He very kindly responded to me, and he sent it to me. So I still have it in my possession. I was able to watch the entire symposium and see various arguments that were offered there. So one suggestion, it was just a suggestion, one suggestion that was made by Rav Rappaport at the time was the following, and I want to begin with this specific topic. And he suggested something which is a little bit outside of what we just discussed. He was talking about the question, and let me discuss the mitzvah of tefillin, for example. Now, when you perform the mitzvah of tefillin, there's always two parts to the mitzvah. There's, so to speak, the active part, and there's the passive part. The active, most people are righties, for example. So if you are a right-handed person, the active part, which is wrapping the tefillin and placing it on the arm, that's performed with your right arm. And the passive part, which is that the tefillin is then going to be placed on your arm, it's going to be there on your arm, that's done with your left arm. So actually both arms involved in the mitzvah of tefillin. The passive part, the left arm, if you happen to be right-handed, has a tefillin on it. And the right hand, that's the part that does the activity of wrapping it. The question he raised involved the question of whether a prosthetic arm, a robotic arm, I should say, which is actively powered by the brain, which does activities, it responds to the commands of the brain, whether it could actually be considered a part and parcel of the human body, and whether the person could wrap tefillin, for example, on this robotic arm. Now, this goes quite a bit beyond anything we just suggested. He's talking about that perhaps the robotic arm could become part and parcel of the individual, like a limb of the person, like part of their body, and that the tefillin that's placed on that robotic arm perhaps would actually halachically be considered to be placed on the person's body. And Rav Rappaport suggested that one could make perhaps a cogent argument in favor of the idea that yes, that this robotic arm, this prosthetic device, which is powered by the brain, that perhaps it is actually a part of the person's body, and that you could wrap tefillin around it, for example. He wanted to compare that to a question that he said he had once asked his grandfather-in-law, Zechron Livracha, Rav Moshe Feinstein. But by the way, a very, very important question. I don't know if this psak of Rav Moshe has been recorded in writing. I don't know, but this is on his DVD, that Rav Rappaport said he asked Rav Moshe about if you would have a testicle transplant from one male donor to a male recipient, and the testicle transplant, the male individual, the recipient, ejects sperm from the donated testicle and fertilizes an ovum and produces a child. So who would be considered to be the parent of this child? Would we say that the testicle donor, who after all is providing all the DNA information, it's his DNA that went into that sperm, is that individual the halachic father of the child, or do we say that it's the recipient? And of course, you recognize and you understand that scientifically, genetically, all the genetic information in the child would certainly come from the genetics, the DNA of the donor. That's whose DNA is in the testicle and is in the sperm. Nonetheless, Rav Rappaport said that Rav Moshe Feinstein responded unequivocally by saying that halachically, the testicle which has been donated is part and parcel and part of the body of the recipient, and that therefore the child would unequivocally have the halachic status of a child, the recipient, despite the fact that there's no DNA information from that recipient, because all the sperm, all the DNA information in the sperm comes from the testicle and the DNA of the donor. Nonetheless, Rav Moshe said it makes no difference at all, and halachically, this testicle is part and parcel of the recipient, and he is the father of the child. Now, incidentally, halachically, in the practical sense, this is not a practical question because testicle donations are not performed today. However, what you do have today, which is quite similar to this, and this is quite relevant, is ovarian transplants, in which one woman's ovaries are transplanted to the uterus of another woman who's infertile and unable to have children. This is very rare today, by the way. We don't usually go this route. It's a very difficult and rare procedure, but it has been successfully done. And it was written about in the news not long ago. We had an ovarian transplant in which the recipient of the ovary was actually able to be the mother of a child, to give birth to an actual child by means of the ovary, the recipient that she had received. So here again, it's exactly the same question, and quite an important and fundamental psak of Rav Moshe Feinstein, which will be applicable over here, that even though genetically the DNA of the ovary, in this case, of the ovum, it certainly all came from the donor. Nonetheless, according to Rabbi Feinstein's psak, that he was told, Rabbi Rappaport was told, the child will be a child of the recipient because the ovary is part and parcel of the recipient. By the way, just as a footnote, it sounds absolutely incredible, but this exact question of uterine transplants, ovarian transplants was discussed over 100 years ago in a sefer called Shuvos Even Yakara, authored by Rabbi Benjamin Ari HaKohen Weiss, the rabbi of Czernowitz in Poland. And in 1913, believe it or not, he published the sefer Even Yakara, which contains a tshuva, halachic ruling on the subject of ovarian transplants. Now, you can ask why in the world he authored a tshuva on this subject when it was actually not even anybody's thoughts to ever be possible to do such a transplant. And the answer is that a rabbi wrote to this Rabbi Weiss and wrote to him that he had heard in the news that it had been done, that it had been performed. So he wanted to know what the status of the child would be, where you had the uterus came from one woman and it was transplanted to a different woman who is the actual halachic mother. So Rabbi Weiss responds by saying immediately that he thinks this is baloney. He can't believe that such a thing was done at all, which was certainly the case over a century ago in 1913. But he says in the event that such a thing would be true, he says, because out of respect for you, the writer, I'm going to respond to you. And he has a very learned and erudite response, a theoretical response, he calls it, in which he also says likewise, the same as we just quoted for Moshe Feinstein, that we would ignore what today we speak of as the genetic information of the DNA, which obviously is that of the donor, and we would say that the child is that of the recipient mother, because that organ became part and parcel of her body. And he makes the following comparison to a passage in the Gemara, which I'll just go through briefly. It's not our main topic today, but a very important parallel he draws to a Gemara, Masechta Soita Daf Mem Gimel. The Gemara over there discusses Yalda Shesivcha Bezekena. That's a question about the laws of Orla. The halacha of Orla, of course, is that the tree produces fruits. After the third year of the tree's growth, the production of fruits, the fruits are permitted to be consumed. First 3 years, fruits are not permitted to be consumed, they're Orla. The question over there comes where I have two trees. One is a Yalda, it's a young tree. Within the first 3 years, the tree is a Zekena, it's an older tree. After the first 3 years, I take a branch from the Yalda, the young tree, and I graft it onto the old tree, and that branch produces fruit. And the question of the Gemara is, do I look at the so-called donor tree, which its branch is from, and say it's a young tree and the fruit is Orla? Or do I look at the recipient tree it was grafted onto, and I'll say that it's not Orla and it's permitted? And the Gemara comes out that the fruit is permitted, that the branch that was grafted from the donor tree, the young donor tree, to the old recipient tree becomes part and parcel of the recipient tree. So Rabbi Weiss makes this comparison, which is a pretty logical comparison. Makes sense, pretty good comparison between in that case, the grafting of branches from the young tree to the old, in this case, the transplanting of the uterus from one woman to the other. In other words, that here too, I would say, based on that Gemara, that the uterus is part and parcel of the recipient. I would ignore any and all genetic information, and I would say that any child that produced is a child of the new mother, okay, the recipient mother. All this makes sense and works well. Rabbi Rappaport went out on a limb here, and he suggested that one could draw a parallel to robotic arms, because they too, after all, they're grafted onto, so well, they're not grafted, but they're, so to speak, grafted onto the recipient of the robotic arm. They're powered by the thoughts of the person. They become part and parcel of that person, and maybe they become a limb of the individual. They become like an arm. Maybe you could even wrap your tefillin around that arm. That's a suggestion that Rabbi Rappaport made on this DVD. I personally don't think that it's I don't think halachically this is a particularly cogent suggestion. I don't think it would work. If you think about it as a kind of thought experiment, I mentioned earlier that this brain-computer interface where the brain waves, the impulses could power a machine, doesn't have to be connected to the person at all. I mentioned they've done actual experiments where they've had a person's brain waves get transmitted wirelessly to a car, and the car was caused to move. The car is obviously not part of a person. I don't think anybody would ever suggest that that car becomes like a limb of the individual at all. It's just the person's brain waves that are being harnessed and translated, so to speak, transformed into electrical energy and being used to power this or that device. And in our case as well, where the device is powering the person's a robotic arm that's connected to him. I don't see any difference, and I don't see any reason to even suggest that such a thing should become part and parcel of the person. So I think that's out of the question, and we would not say that you could put tefillin on the device. But what's much, much more of a cogent suggestion is the idea that the person is powering the activity that gets done, and therefore it's your activity, right? You throw a ball, the ball lands somewhere, and it does damage. That's your responsibility. It's your kocho, that's your energy. The Gemara tells us that kocho kagufo, right? Your energy is like your body. You flip a switch and it operates a machinery, and the machinery does something. That's your reaction as well. So likewise over here, you sent out these electrical impulses by means of your thoughts, and they powered something, and we could certainly argue that should be called your action. Now, Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was actually asked this question not too long before his passing. He was asked, in the context of a brain-computer interface, he was asked this shaila, which wasn't actually operative at that time, but scientists were looking into it. A couple of people asking this question, and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach both times responded that we could draw a parallel to the halacha of hafrashas teruma, separating truma. Now, separating truma is not allowed on Shabbos. You're not allowed to separate truma on Shabbos. You have tevel needs to be tied. You can't separate the truma on Shabbos. It's called tikkun mana. It's an act of fixing on the Rabbanan level. It's like a malacha, and you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach pointed out that we have a din that truma could be separated b'machshava. That means you have some grain at this end of the room and grain at that end of the room, and with my machshava, with my thought, I identify the grain at the left-hand side. That's going to be my truma, and it becomes truma. That's halachically, your thoughts are powerful in the halachic field of truma. And Rosh Hashanah went further and brought a proof from a Tosfos in Masechta Gittin that even when you separate truma with your thoughts, you're not allowed to do so on Shabbos. So Rosh Zalman felt that demonstrates that in the halachic world, we do look at activities that are powered by your thoughts as your actions. Now, of course, 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years on the time of the Gemara, they didn't have the exact brain-computer interface devices that we have today. But remarkably, Rosh Zalman Auerbach came up with this parallel to an actual act that was performable in those times, truma, which you could perform with your thoughts, and it was usher. Now, one key point, if you look at the psak, this psak is recorded in back of the Sefer Ma'orei Eish. It's an oral psak that he gave, but it's recorded by the person, people who heard it. And Shlomo Zalman added over there the following words. He said, you see that that's called a malacha on Shabbos, when you're powered by your thoughts. Al kol ponim midrabanan. We'll come back to that. That's very important. Al kol ponim midrabanan. So in other words, he's conceding that it might be apparently likely only a rabbinic level prohibition, not a Torah level prohibition. That might make a big difference in our context. If it's only drabanan, maybe we could look for a way that it might be permitted on Shabbos for this individual who needs it, who's going to be unable to move his arm without it. We'll come back to that. I actually saw this. Doing a little research, I saw that Rav Elyashiv Zechron Livrocha says very, very similar thing in Sefer of his recorded lectures on the Masechta Yuma, the Ha'orois of Rav Elyashiv on the Masechta Yuma, Daf Ayin Hey. Rav Elyashiv doesn't discuss brain-computer interface directly, but actually makes a very, very similar argument. Now, Rav Elyashiv discusses this in the context of a question that's asked by a number of Achronim. He brings this question from the Chidah, Rav Chaim Yosef David Azaloi, who lived 200 years ago, and the Chidah asked the following question. In the Pasuk in B'Shalach, it says that the Jewish people got the mun when they were in the desert. The mun came double portion on Fridays, and they had to cook whatever was going to be cooked, cook it before Shabbos. You want to bake it, you got to bake you cook it before Shabbos. The Chidah asked, why did they have to cook it before Shabbos? Why not cook it on Shabbos, given the fact that there's a mechilta from which the Chidah and other Achronim derive from the language of the mechilta, that you were able to cook them on with your thoughts. You thought, just like you could think what you wanted it to taste, as we know, you could even think that you wanted it cooked, and it came cooked simply miraculously. It means of your thoughts. So the Chidah asked, so why not cook the man on Shabbos by means of your thoughts? So that is the question raised by the Chidah and by some other Achronim. And Rav Elyashiv conjectures that maybe the answer to this question is that malacha that's done by means of your thoughts is considered to be malacha. And there are some Achronim, by the way, that actually make that suggestion. There's a Klichem that suggests that you see from this context of the mun, that if they would do the work of cooking, baking the mun by means of their thoughts, which they were able to do, it would have the quality of a malacha, and that's why you couldn't do it on Shabbos. Rabbi Yashiv, however, rejects this teretz, and this is very important for our context. He says that even accepting that it could be a malacha, and he says likely it is a malacha because he draws the same parallel to truma that Rav Auerbach drew. In other words, the idea that we find the person powers the hafrashas truma with his thoughts. I think this grain on the left side should be truma, and it's truma. So you power the hafrasha with your thoughts, and it is effective, but it's also on Shabbos, right? So that's called a malacha when you power with your thoughts. Yashi says, well, here too, it's a malacha here as well, but it's only D'Rabbanan. He asserts as well, like Auerbach asserted, it would not be a Deraisa, it would be a D'Rabbanan. So therefore, it's not a real activity for Shabbos purposes, as we'll see. And therefore, he says, you really need a different teretz to the kasha, because over there, we're not talking D'Rabbanan, we're talking the Torah, the Almighty. Hashem himself is telling the people that, you have to cook it before Shabbos, bake it before Shabbos. We're not talking D'Rabbanan over there. So he actually suggests, Rabbi Yashiv, he has a whole analysis of the Sugya and the Gemara there, and he suggests that the idea that thoughts could power the workings, the processing of the grain of the mun, that was only for tzaddikim. The way he understands the sugya, he says that ordinary people are not able to power the baking, cooking by means of their thoughts, and therefore says Rav Yashiv, he says that's the answer why the Torah says you had to cook it before Shabbos, because the ordinary people couldn't power it with their thoughts. Oh, but the point is, and this is the first stage of our discussion, very important point. Here we see that both Rav Yashiv and Rosh Zalman Auerbach made the same parallel to the sugya of hafroshas truma, to designating separating truma on Shabbos, where we see that it is also to separate it by means of one's thoughts, and huadin, the same as to any malacha that you could do with your thoughts, which of course today, in the upcoming years, going to be much, much more relevant than it has been till now. Of course, you don't have to look at miracles today, like in the context of the mun. Even without miracles, they're going to be having these devices. So it would be an issue, but they both add that in their view, it would only be D'Rabbanan. Now we have to come back to that. Why? But that's what they assume, and that's quite relevant to our context. Now, another very important source text on this topic, which talks in just much broader terms than Shabbos, in terms of something you do with your thoughts. Does that have the halachic quality of being your activity? Is it kocho? Is it your act? Now, I just want to add, just a point to frame the question for a second. If a person flips a switch or throws a ball and the ball travels and it does damage, you flip a switch and it bakes matzahs or whatever, it comes up on Pesach, you flip a machine matzahs. You flip the switch and it bakes the matzah, and that's considered by many poskim to be your activity, and it's baked l'shma, and many hold that you could use it even for the Seder night when you have to have matzahs better l'shem matzahs mitzvah. So those are your actions, but they begin with a physical activity on your part. You manually threw that ball into the air. You manually flipped the switch. It started with an act on your part, and the subsequent result that gets done, the damage, the baking of the matzahs, whatever it is attributed to the action that you did. In the case at hand, however, it didn't originate with an action at all. It originates with thoughts in the person's brain. One could question whether that actually is called the kocho of the individual in the halachic world, even if we know scientifically that the person did generate that process and that the end result is attributable to the original thoughts and the original electric impulses that you sent out of your brain. Even though that is so, one could question whether the halachic world that is recognized, right? It's not visible. It's not these thoughts that you sent out of your mind. They have machinery that could detect it. It certainly isn't visible to the naked eye. To the naked eye, we don't see anything at all that you did. And in the halachic world, one would question whether this truly really is called your act or not. It's a very cogent question. Certainly needs to be raised. So one of these source texts as follows is a sefer called Shuvos Halachos Ketanos. Small halachas. Halachas Ketanos. Now, Shuvos Halachos Ketanos was written approximately 1650 or so by Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz. It's an important halachic work. It takes its name from the fact that Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz was in the habit of offering short answers to the questions that were asked. He was not a verbose individual. He gave short answers. The collection of his rulings is called Halachos Ketanos. Its sefer is 350 odd years old today. And Halachos Ketanos discusses the question of somebody who kills another individual by means of witchcraft, or lahavdil, by means of using the name of Hashem. You have, in Parshas Shmos, Chazal tell us that Moshe Rabbeinu killed the Mitzri by means of using the name of Hashem. Apparently, if you're a very person on some kind of an exalted level, you're able to kill people by using Hashem's name. Or anybody could use witchcraft, kishuf, if you know how to do it, I guess, and you could kill someone. And the question that was raised, that was asked of Rabbi Chagiz, was whether the individual who used the witchcraft or lahavdil, the name of Hashem, is he a murderer? Is the act attributable to him? And it sounds like he was even asked at some level whether you could put the person to death for murder. Right? Would this person be liable for murder? Is it considered to be your act? And he said that in his opinion, the answer is yes. By the way, the Halacha says a language of efshar. Could be that since your words were powerful and they performed an act, they did an activity, so therefore the action is attributable to you, and you are considered to be the murderer who put this individual to death. That's what the Halacha Tanos, who lived, as we said, around 1650. The Chidah, Reb Chaim Yaakov Zavar Azuloi, who lived a couple of hundred years ago, around 1800, and in his Sefer Dvash Lepi, he quotes this psak and makes 2 points. First of all, he actually leaves out the word efshar. In other words, he seems to assert, the Chidah, that this is a certainty in his mind that the person who powered the activity by means of kishuf or lahavdil, pronouncing Hashem's name, which performed this activity, that would be considered to be liable, and it would truly be considered his act. But then the Chidah takes it a step further, much further, and the Chidah writes that he thinks that perhaps we could even go further and talk about a Gemara, a couple of places. Gemara says about an Amora, one of the Amoroim of the Gemara, Nasan Einov Boy, Venase Gal Shalatzomois. Now you got to look at the context, but in a couple of places the Gemara discusses that we have that an Amora looked at a person and the person turned into a pile of bones. We don't know exactly, but in some fashion, the gaze of the Amora, his look, caused this individual to die. They became a pile of bones. So, says the Chidah, maybe that's also comparable to the case in hand. Maybe it's the Amora's action. Maybe he's considered to be someone who killed someone else by means of this Nosan Einobo, placing his eye upon this individual. So on that, the Chidah says that I wouldn't go that far, because he has a Kabbalistic explanation there where he says that this works very differently. When you're Nasan Einobo, he says you draw out the holy spark, the Kedusha, that's in the person you're looking at, and the person dies as a result of that, because he's like a shell. He lost all of his spark of Kedusha, and thereby he dies. That's not a direct act on your part at all. You just drew out the Kedusha. He says that's different. That you wouldn't apply to that the notion that's considered your activity. But what we don't see in this whole discussion of the Chidah, now we don't know how to do magic today, and we don't really know much about the names of Hashem. We don't know much about any of those things. But where we can derive something fundamental on the conceptual level from here, and that is that we see from the idea that's articulated by the Chidah that, and the conceptual level he understood, if I think, and thereby by means of my thoughts, in his case, I'm looking, and look with your eye, you're not doing any physical activity, is looking at the person, right? I mean, they're looking at the person is not manipulating any limb of your body. You're looking at him, and you're looking at that person that generates the person's death. The Chidah had a serious discussion about that. That's your activity, which is actually halachically attributable to you, and perhaps we consider you to be the killer. Now, granted that in that particular scenario, he has a Kabbalistic approach that gets around it, but within the conceptual framework that we're discussing, we see the idea that the Chidah considered this to be your action. So in our context, we don't have any Kabbalistic ideas that are going to shunt this aside, and it's going to be relevant to us that the Chidah presumably, logically would hold that the person powers some machinery by means of his thoughts, like the cases that we're giving, that we're actually considered to be your activity, it's your act, and you will be responsible for halachically for the act that you did. So all of that is quite important to our discussion, and we'll come back in a moment. We have to see if we can reconcile the sources that we spoke of. According to the Chidah, he doesn't say anything about rabbinic, about the Rabbanon. To the contrary, it seems clear from the Chidah that he understands that an activity powered by your thoughts is a Torah level activity, and it's truly yours, and you're 100% responsible for it. Rabbi Yashiv And Rav Auerbach, on the other hand, in the context of Shabbos, seem to have assumed that it's likely that it's only a rabbinic prohibition on Shabbos. So we need to work that out. Is there something special, unique about Shabbos that would make it only rabbinic in the context of Shabbos? But let's just first set up a couple of scenarios. We started discussing this before, just set it up a little bit more in detail. Imagine we'll go outside of the Shabbos context for a second and discuss the question of the chassan putting a ring on the finger of the kala. Now, this question, a paralyzed chassan, a chassan with paralyzed limbs, and wants to marry the kala, and how is he going to marry her? How is he going to put the ring on her finger? This question certainly has come up in the past, well before there was BCI, the brain-computer interface, and Rosh Zalman Auerbach was asked a couple of times about this question. His psukim, his rulings are quoted in the Sefer Nishmas Avraham on medical halacha, and he was asked about the condition of a person with paralyzed arms. How is this individual going to mekadesh the kala, put the ring, effectuate the halachic marriage if he can't do the act of placing the ring on her finger? So Rav Shlomo Zalman responded by saying there's no need specifically for him to put the ring on her finger, but the but is he definitely does have to do some sort of an action, some sort of an activity, which is halachically accepted as an act. So he said, for a person who's paralyzed, very often they could move their hand very slightly. So put the ring in his hand, right near the edge of his palm of his hand. He'll hold it over the kala's hand, and she'll cup her hands, and he'll move his palm, just shake it, a very slight shake. He'll shake it out of his hand and into her hand. That's called his action, and thereby he's considered to have done the kedushin with his activity, and thereby it's halachically effective kedushin. So this is a psak of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and this is something we would ask in the context of the robotic arm. The person has power with his thoughts. Is that considered to be the individual's action when he puts the ring on her finger? Remember that it's not a simple matter, because arguably this is somewhat weaker than Rav Shlomo Zalman's case, since over here you didn't shake your arm. What you did was sent out brain waves and electrical impulses from your brain, which perhaps, arguably, the brain waves themselves, the impulses themselves are subvisual. Nobody could see them with the naked eye. Nobody could sense them with the naked eye. And that's all the activity that's attributable to you. And we could argue, therefore, that even though scientifically everything that resulted from that and the movement of the robotic arm certainly was generated by you, nonetheless, there was no actual action that was done by you. It was generated by your thoughts, not by any action that you did, perhaps halachically, that would not be your thoughts. So we would have to raise this question, and the same as I mentioned before, in the context of the giving of a get, which is always done by very, very precise standards. And in this case, person with a robotic arm, his arm became paralyzed, he's married to the woman, he wants to give the get. Is he able to do that with his robotic arm? And finally, the question, as we mentioned earlier, the question about the damages that you cause with your robotic arm. Now, I think morally we all feel that this is something the person ought to be responsible for. You move your robotic arm and you cause damages and hezek, and you ought to be responsible for that. Nonetheless, one could argue that bedine adam, that's within the court system, it may not be litigable because of the fact, maybe it can't be collected because of the fact it's not a maaseh gomor, it's not a full-fledged activity that you caused. You generated the act, certainly. At least we could argue that you are a grumma. You caused the damages to be done. A grumma is liable bedine shamayim, the hands of heaven, and the law of heaven. You're going to have to pay back. But is it litigable in courts? Because the court would only collect if you did an actual maaseh hezek, an actual act of a hezek, and we would need to ask whether this is considered to be your action. So I think, and I just want to say at this point, we're not here to offer conclusive answers to these questions, and we need more poskim. We need big poskim to weigh in on the BCI and on the details, which certainly is going to happen in the upcoming years as it becomes more commonplace, and it goes out of the lab and becomes something which people actually get transplanted, these robotic arms, and the question goes to the leading poskim. But it's possible to offer some, based on some of the thinking that we've offered till now, the sources that we offered, and another source we'll get to shortly, one could offer some tentative proposals about the way that halacha would address these topics. So first of all, if you go outside of Shabbos, putting Shabbos, Hilchos Shabbos aside, it seems likely, based on the psak of the Chidah, if we accept the Chidah's writings as determinative for our halacha, we would say that according to the Chidah in the Sefer Dvash Lapi that we quoted before, we do say that an activity that's done by a person's thoughts, generated by their thoughts, and leads to an actual action, that's the person's halachic action in the world of the halacha, and he's responsible for it, and likewise, he also gets credit for it, so to speak, with regard to all halachas of actions. We said that the Chidah actually had a discussion in the context of a couple of Talmudic passages. Nasan Einav boy looks at the person, becomes a pile of bones. Nasa Gal Shalat Samis, maybe you're a killer. So he gets around it with a Kabbalistic interpretation of that Gemara. But you do see that the Chidah understood that it's a Maaseh Gomor, and likewise, I would think that according to the Chidah, if we accept his ruling halachic as determinative, we would say that the person who uses the robotic arm to put the ring on the Kala's finger, or to put the get into her hand, or to do damages, in all of these contexts, we would say that in all these contexts, we would say that the person is credited with that act and is responsible for that act, and it is considered to be a Maaseh Gomer. Which leads to the question, why is it that on Shabbos, Rav Auerbach and Rav Elyashiv understood that activities powered by your thoughts are only the Rabbanan? And it seems that Rav Elyashiv said this in the context of the actual robotic arm, the brain-computer interface, which was not real in practice in his time, but the scientists were already working on it. And he was asked a question about that, and he drew the parallel to Truma on Shabbos, which is usher, even though it's done with your thoughts. You can't separate Truma on Shabbos. It's halachically effective, and it's halachically usher on Shabbos, but nonetheless assume that likely it would only be the Rabbanan. And the same with Rav Elyashiv. Why would it be the Rabbanan on Shabbos if it's I hope I'm not muted now. Why would it be halachically the Rabbanon on Shabbos if it's the Raisa for all other areas of halacha? And this is very important to ask, because I think that the question is going to come up most frequently with regard to Hilchos Shabbos. A person is fitted with this robotic arm. They don't want to be paralyzed one day a week. 6 days a week they use the arm, and on Shabbos they can't use it. It seems impossible. So we certainly would like to know whether we can find some halachic heter. If it's only the Rabbanon, that would be a good start. So just briefly, I'd like to offer the following, and then we'll come back to something of another source, how we could rule. Some have ruled, and we'll talk about possible rulings on this robotic arm for Shabbos use. What's important to speak of in this context is the principle, the halachic yesod of the base mayor, mayor of Posen, and the base mayor it articulates a concept, a conceptual understanding of Meleches Shabbos. And he says that Meleches Shabbos, as opposed to various other areas of the halacha, Meleches Shabbos is something which is looked at from the perspective of the individual doing the act. Are you at work or are you at rest? We don't look at the achievement that was done, the nif'al, what was achieved. We look at the person, the doer, the poel. Are you working or are you at rest? And this is a very important principle. And he says he thinks this is based on the simple language of the Torah. L'ma'an yonuach, right? A person should be at rest. Tishbos, tishbos. It's all a question of whether you're working, physically at rest. So he says that the determinative principle on Shabbos is not a question of what was achieved by you, but a question of whether you were physically at rest or not. And that's why the base mayor suggests a possible proposal that even if we hold, which is a whole discussion, some poskim hold that is yesh shliach l'dvar aveira, insofar as the rabbinic level, a person sends an agent to do an aveira. Many poskim hold that rabbinically the aveira is attributed to the person who sent it. But as far as Shabbos goes, there'll be no such thing. So, for example, and this is a very real thing, we have an entire field of halacha called Amira La'akum on Shabbos. Amira La'nochri. Person commands a guy to do the activity, the guy does it on Shabbos, and you get the sin. You get the aveira for that. So what's the defining idea behind Amir L'Nochri? Says the base mayor, it's just a gzeira, it's a new, separate kind of a side gzeira, but it cannot be explained by means of this shlichus idea. We do not say that the guy is your agent to do the aveira, and like we find in other contexts, you do an aveira by means of an agent, you're responsible for it. That's not applicable here. Why? Because you're at rest. You're physically at rest. You didn't do a work, you did a rest. I don't care, he says, that the activity was engendered by you and ultimately you brought it about. The fact that you were physically at rest is a determinative point when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos. Now, the Beis Meir in the end comes out that actually, as far as Shabbos goes, we're more strict, and we do look at the person, the goy, as your shliach, and he's like your agent, but that's a bit of a side discussion. Numerous poskim understand from the Beis Meir, and some quote him la halacha, that Shabbos is different from other areas of halacha in the sense that as Shabbos goes, I'm not looking at whether I engendered or brought about a result, but I look at whether you rested or you were not at rest. Tishbos, be at rest as opposed to not being at rest. Therefore, in the context of Shabbos, I think it's fair to ask in our context here, with the brain-computer interface, the robotic arm, even if we would say, as far as all other areas of the halacha, that the action that you did is your action and is attributable to you. Nonetheless, as far as Shabbos goes, you were at rest. Now, I guess you weren't fully at rest because you emitted electrical impulses by means of your brains. But of course, everybody emits electrical impulses with their brain all day on Shabbos. That's not part of resting versus work on Shabbos. When the brain sends out impulses, that's just thinking. We're not obligated to stop thinking on Shabbos, of course. It's not part of the malachos. It's not part of the prohibitions of Shabbos. Consequently, since over here also all you did was to emit impulses from your brain, it's certainly arguable that the person is at rest as far as Shabbos goes, and I think that that could be a cogent way to explain the distinction here, why why they understood as pretty much that was almost a given in their eyes, that they seem to have believed that it's likely that as far as doing an activity with your thoughts on Shabbos, it would only be d'Rabbanan and it would not be d'Oraisa. It may be something which is local and specific to Shabbos because of the nature of the Hilchos Shabbos, the prohibition of Shabbos, which is a question of physically interacting or not physically interacting with the work, physically being at rest or not being at rest. In this case, one could argue that since all you did was brain activity, that's considered that you were physically at rest. Okay, so then let's kind of cut to the chase and discuss Hilchos Shabbos. I mean, and again, this is really the biggest question that surely will come up. Person was fitted with this robotic arm, which is going to be happening. It's going to be out of the market within a reasonable number of years, and people will be fitted with this arm. Will they be able to use their thoughts to power the electrical circuitry within the arm and cause an electric current, obviously, to close, and all the usual way that electricity works, and power the device and grab a cup of coffee and drink it with this robotic arm, or whatever it is that they want to do, lift a fork and eat with the robotic arm? Or do you say that they're considered to be utilizing an electrical device on Shabbos, which we don't do? We don't run electrical devices on Shabbos. Well, maybe it's only with his thoughts and it's different. So, as we mentioned already, one could argue that it's only Rabbanan, because Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Elyashiv understood when I power activities with my thoughts on Shabbos, it's only the Rabbanan. That's part of the way there, but doesn't get us all the way there. We do keep the Rabbanan on Shabbos as well. What would make it mutter? Is it a way to make considered permitted? So there's a very important halachic ruling which is actually written up and is available online from Rav Osher Weiss Shlita. Rav Osher Weiss was asked an important question about a somewhat different question. By the way, his case that he was asked about is not quite as lenient as ours. It's actually arguably somewhat more strict than ours. The case he was asked about was with regard to eye gaze technology. Eye gaze technology, I'm sure you're familiar with. That's when people have, for example, ALS patients who unfortunately, lo aleinu, become paralyzed, eventually reach the point that all the limbs are paralyzed, the ALS, and they're generally able to move their eyes. They can move their eyes, and they have this technology, the eye gaze technology, where they have this machine that's able to pick up on the eye movement and is able to translate the eye movement. And what they have is that the machine today is able to actually spell out letters. They're perfecting this, by the way, this technology. They're making it work better and better. They're not just spelling out letters, but they're working on the upcoming technologies where they're able to manipulate machinery and actually do activities or with this person's movement of the person's eyes. Now, again, that case, he was asked about using this eye gaze technology on Shabbos, which obviously is going to be manipulating machinery and is to be using electricity. by means of this person's eyes. Is there any way to do it? If you can't use the eye gate technology on Shabbos, a person is going to be, unfortunately, totally uncommunicative and unable to communicate with anyone throughout the whole Shabbos, which is obviously a terrible fate. So what would be the heter to do that? Rav Weiss responded that he believed one could be lenient in this exceptional tzorach gadol. It's a tremendous, tremendous need. And he said one could be lenient with the argument of shvus b'shvus, the makam tzorach gadol. That's a halachic concept. You have a double derabanan and a very, very great need. And then on Shabbos with the double derabanan with the very great need, I would be able to be lenient. In this case, he said, we have two derabbanans that combine together. It's only derabanan because of two ideas. Number one, it's electricity. Now that's actually an old question, but as you know, many poskim hold that the use of electricity on Shabbos, closing a circuit, causing the machine to perform some acts with the electricity. So the use of electricity on Shabbos, according to many poskim, is only derabanan, and that's the first argument, that's the first reason that this technology only derabanan. Secondly, he says it's kala'achar yad, which is to say it's very unusual. Obviously, 99.999% of the population does not use this sort of eye gaze technology to do activities. Only these very, very small number of people who need it, because they're paralyzed, they're the ones who use it. That's considered to be kala'achar yad, an unusual activity. And a Shabbos kala'achar yad, by the way, it lacks in something called melechas machsheves, focused activity, and not melechas machsheves, and that's another reason it's only rabbanan. He has a discussion, by the way, of the obvious question that it's a very normal act for this particular patient, unfortunately, who can't communicate any other way. Nonetheless, Rav Weiss is comfortable saying that this is considered to be kala'achar yad. It's very unusual. Most people would never dream of moving things with this particular technology. So because it's only electricity, that's one derabanan. Second derabanan is kala'achar yad, and it's a very, very great tzorach gadol, great need. So therefore, with all those factors together, Rav Weiss permits the use of this eye gaze technology on Shabbos. Now, actually, we have all those same arguments in our case as well. And the person with, pretty much you have it. I mean, obviously, the person who has a paralyzed, has missing a limb, missing a lower limb, missing a right arm, and is using this robotic arm, is not quite in the same, a very super unfortunate position of the ALS patient, but nonetheless, obviously, it's a tremendous tzorach for the person to have the use of their right arm. They have the use of this robotic arm 6 days a week, Sunday to Friday. It's going to be a terrible calamity if they don't have the use of it on Shabbos as well. So therefore, one could certainly make the same argument. It's a tzorach gadol ma'od. It's a shvus to shvus, according to Rav Osher Weiss, because it's only electricity, A, which many poskim say is the Rabbanan. It's considered to be very unusual. That's B, the way he understands it. And with all those factors together, that's another reason to argue that you could permit it. In addition, as we said before, there's actually an additional factor here, which you don't have in the case of the ALS patient, the eye gaze technology. The other factor is that over here, since you're only powering it with your thoughts, according to Avayashin or Shlomo Zalman, it seems that they accept that it's anyway only the Rabbanan as far as Shabbos goes, because it's only thoughts and it's not a physical involvement and physical work on Shabbos. You're only sending out thoughts with your brain. That's an additional reason why we be only the Rabbanan. Now, you don't have that in the case of the ALS patient because that person is moving their eyes. They're you doing an actual activity, moving their eyes. The eye movement in turn is setting about a whole Rube Goldberg contraption, is setting aside a whole process by which eventually is ending in a machine doing activity. But the fact is it's beginning with an action on your part, the actual movement of your eyes, and still Rav Weiss was lenient about that case, and certainly over here there's an additional factor, additional leniency, because of the fact that it's only the person's thoughts that they're sending out. So if all of these are all obviously only tentative arguments, but these are arguments based upon well-known sources that we mentioned. If we accept all those, I just want to mention the tentative conclusion you would end up with if you accept this, just to summarize quite briefly, is that as far as all areas of the halacha other than Shabbos, if we accept the Chida's argument, we would say that actions that are powered by your thoughts would be halachically your actions 100%, both negative and positive, halachically, ramifications. Person could be able to do a kedushin, put the ring on her finger with the robotic arm, and she'd be 100% married. He could cause damages, he'd be 100% liable in court. Those would be your actions based on the idea that the Chidah seems to understand that even your thoughts powering something, powering an activity, makes it your activity. When it comes to Shabbos, though, we would be able to be more lenient, which, of course, as we said, is really, really of paramount importance to find that if there is a leniency, you want to know if there is one, because it's something which will come up all the time to people that receive these limbs. And as far as Shabbos, there will be room to be lenient based upon the Usher Weiss's psak and the additional factor that we mentioned. And the argument would go that since there are possibly multiple D'Rabbanans involved, and there is a tzorech gadol ma'od, a tremendous, which obviously there is a tremendous need, so therefore one would argue be able to be lenient about the use of this arm, this robotic arm, on the Shabbos. Thank you so much, Rabbi Blank. I think that's pretty much the end of my part.
I thank you very, very much, Rabbi Langer. I don't have any questions at the moment that's being asked. As I mentioned earlier, this presentation, I would just say, it's a remarkable, amazing shiur that you gave. It was recorded, and it will be promoted and sent to the Rabbinical Council of America and Rabbinical Alliance of America websites, and within the week, maybe even earlier. I must tell you that all those who are in your kollel and all those in the community, the medical community, the regular community, are truly fortunate to have you as the Rosh Kollel. And I hope that B'ezras Hashem, that we can return for an additional shiur with you and your how you present halacha, Torah and halacha in various different ways, how it can be applied, and how important it is for us with all the rabbanim to be aware of, and chaplains as well. And we should be zecher de gula shlema b'kar v'amein sela. Again, thank you very much, Rabbi Langer. All those who would like information about the RCA, the RAA, or the Orthodox Jewish Healthcare Chaplaincy listserv, or about professional chaplaincy in general, or about our future programs, please contact me at rablenblank@gmail.com. That's rablenblank@gmail.com. And all those who would like to contact Rabbi Langer about the shiur that he gave today, a wonderful presentation, any shaylas that you might have, or additional information, Rabbi Langer, what is your contact information?
Sure. Langer@kololpgh.org. LLANGER@kololpgh, KOLLELPGH.org. And thank you so much for your kind words.
Thank you. Once again, on behalf of Rabbi Langman, Rabbi Dratch, Rabbi Marachnik, Rabbi Kramer, the REA Chaplaincy Commission members, I thank you for joining us. And again, we should be zecher de gula shlema b'karov, Mashiach tzidkenu b'mhev yameinu amen sela. Thank you so much.
Amen.